Now that we have the basic understanding of how loops work or how iteration happens in software engineering as we are programming, and we get this basic understanding which applies to all programming languages, now we're going to learn about the specific structures and syntax that JavaScript provides us in order to iterate over data or complete repetitive tasks as we program in JavaScript. Now, in this example, we're pretty much going to follow our conceptual model here. We are going to learn about for loops, and for loops use a counter, which we've got right here. It uses a condition check that equates to true or false, and that determines whether or not we continue with the loop or whether or not we move on with our program. And it uses the incrementation of the counter in order to slowly move up the number of times we've looped in order to meet the condition that we're checking to determine whether or not we should move on with the program or whether or not we should move down on into the loop code again and do another repetitive task or access another piece of data out of a list. So let's dive into the syntax really quick, and let's do that here on our whiteboard. And let's do the structure of a for loop. So this is a for loop in JavaScript. And we're going to walk through how we do a for loop and what the syntax is for a for loop. Now, as with everything in JavaScript, we have a keyword that we use that indicates that we are now beginning to create a for loop. And that is using the keyword for, which makes sense. Now, as we talked about, for loops can use a counter. So here is where the syntax is very specific to JavaScript. In our for loop, we can set a counter. So we're going to create a variable called counter. We are going to set it to 0, which means we're going to start our counting at 0, which is often the way you do it. You can do it pretty much any way you want if you don't need to go all the way through the list or you're going to start at a different place in the list. But usually we're starting at the very beginning of a list and we're going to move all the way to the end. Or if we're talking about repetitive tasks, usually we're going to start counting at 0 because we're 0 based in JavaScript, and then we're going to move up to the number of times it needs to be completed. In this example, though, I think we're going to be doing a repetitive task, and so we are going to go ahead and we're going to start out at 0 and see what happens when we actually code it up. So we'll do counter equals 0. And now this is where we get to our conditional check, where we want to see if we should continue moving inside of our loop or we should break out and move on with our application. So this is going to be the conditional check expression that we're going to have in our for loop. And so here we're going to check, is our counter less than or equal to some external variable that holds the number of times our repetitive task should happen. So let's go ahead and let's set up the variable right now, and then we'll put it outside so we can see where it's at and what it holds. So we've got counter is less than or equal to the num times task should run. All right, so the number of times the task should run. And then, like we talked about, we need to increment the counter each time we execute the loop. So let's go ahead and do that. And then, just like with a function, we will have a curly brace, a block, so 2 curly braces, and then inside the curly braces is where, of course, our code would be. So code goes here. So this is the basic structure of a for loop in JavaScript. So let's point out the components really quick again. We've got our keyword right here, for, which tells JavaScript we are creating a loop. We've got our counter, which of course is just a variable because we're using let in order to set up the variable, and then we are initializing that variable to 0. We have ourselves our conditional check, which equates to true or false because we are using the less than or equal to, where we are saying, hey, is counter less than or equal to the number of times run? And if so, let's go ahead and execute the loop. Then we have our counter with the plus plus operator, which just says take the value in the counter, add 1 to it, and then shove that value back into counter. And this gives us that auto incrementing ability to our counter each time our loop is executed. So this is the basic structure of a for loop in JavaScript when we break it out into its component parts. So let's go ahead and label those really quick so we know what is what. So we've got our keyword that tells us that this is a for loop. We have our counter variable set up right here. We have our condition right here that we are checking for true or false on. And then we have the incrementer right here. Incrementor, who knows if that's even proper English, but we're going to call it an incrementer. So this is our incrementer right here. So make sure you understand the syntax for a for loop so that you really understand what's happening. We're setting up our counter, we're creating the condition that checks to see if we should continue looping or move on. And then we have the incrementer that updates our counter. And then we have our code where we do something. So let's move on to a real example and let's actually program ourselves a counter out here that we can run and see how it works. So again, for, and we're going to set up our counter, let counter equals 0. We want to set it to 0 first, and then we're going to do our condition. Counter is counter less than or equal to. Now here's where we have our external thing that we're checking against, and in this case it's let num times task should run, and let's say we need this task to run 5 times. So this is going to be the external thing that we are using in our check, and in this case it's a variable that holds the number of times our task needs to run. And so that gives us our conditional check right here, and our check is based off of the less than or equal to. So we're comparing this number to this number, and if this is less than or equal to this, we're going to go ahead and run what is inside of our for loop. If it's not, we're going to break out and continue on with our code. And then of course we've got our counter incrementer. So we're going to go ahead and use the + right there. And now we've got the body of our for loop. So to keep things simple so we can see what we're doing, we're going to go ahead and in the body of our for loop, we're just going to do a console.log, and we're going to log our counter really quick. And let's add some text to it just so we can see what's happening here. Counter, and then let's do in text the same thing we got here, that plus the num times it needs to run. And that way we can actually see that mathematical expression or that comparison happening as it executes in our console. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a console.log outside of our for loop just so we can see the order of operation. We can see that this doesn't get executed until after the for loop has finished doing everything it's supposed to do, and then it breaks out once the condition ends up being false. And let's go ahead and add some text here. This will not execute until the for loop is done. I'm not spelling right, done. All right. Now let's go ahead and run this really quick. Let's see what happens. Let's do start debug. Okay, 0, is it less than or equal to 5? Yes. So let's go ahead and execute the code. And you'll see that it executed the code right here. Counter is 0. Num of times is going to be 5 because that's how many times we did it. And this variable doesn't change because this is our external check against we're checking our counter. And if this changed and this changed, there's a high probability we're going to end up with an infinite loop and it'll never stop running and then everything will crash, right? So we need an external thing to compare against that is pretty solid so we can be sure our for loop will end. And then we go through each time all the way up to 5. Now if you'll notice, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Our loop actually executed 6 times before this final console.log got executed, which was outside of our for loop. But the number of times the task should run was set to 5, but we executed it 6 times. And that is simply because we started our counter at 0, and our incrementer right here increments by 1, but our check right here, counter, is less than or equal to num times task runs. So the order of operation, if we look at this, we can see that this ran 6 times. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plus the 0 times, so that makes it 6 times, but it should have only run 5 times. And that is because we set up the counter, then this check happens. Is the counter less than or equal to the num times task run? And in this case, we're using less than or equal to. So the way we could fix this is we could get rid of the equal to. And now if we execute it, it should only be 5 times. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that equals 5 times. And this comes from a zero-based perspective where we are starting our counting at 0 instead of at 1, which we're used to doing as humans. But zero-based, we're starting at 0. And so we can just remove the equals in order to fix that, or we can start our counter at 1 and count like a human instead of a computer. And then if we run this again, we should see it only 5 times as well. But this time we should see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A little bit more human readable for us. Really, you just have to keep in mind that it depends on what you're using in your comparison operator and what you're using in your counter. And then you have to realize that your counter increment, you have to know when that happens in the execution. So right here, we're starting at 1, we're doing the check, we're executing the code, then the counter increments, then we get the check again, and we go through this code here. So just make sure you're cognizant of that. Make sure you understand that, when you're trying to iterate over something, you need to understand where you should start your counter based on what kind of comparison you're doing and when your counter gets incremented based on the type of looping structure you're using. So hopefully this was super simple and you can understand a for loop. Again, let's run through this really quick. I'm going to go ahead and use some arrows, and let's go ahead and use a good color we can see. So here we've got our external pretty solid value that we are going to use inside of our check. This way we know at some point our for loop will terminate and we can move on with our application. Otherwise we'll end up in an infinite loop, which will just cause everything to crash. We've got our keyword for, which says, hey JavaScript, go set up memory and let's get ready to set up a looping structure. We've got our counter, which is set up as our first expression here. A for loop takes 3 expressions, 1, 2, and 3. It takes in our counter, it takes in our condition, and it allows us to increment our counter automatically for us. And what this does right here is it pretty much means we just have to worry about the body of our loop, make sure that this thing is doing what it's supposed to. We don't have to worry about incrementing our counter. The for loop does it for us. We don't have to worry about doing a check manually. The for loop does it for us. And then, of course, we set up a counter and it handles incrementing it for us. So a for loop is really easy. It's really good looping structure when you know how many times something needs to happen, right? When you know this number and you have a counter that you can compare against it, for loops are awesome. For loops are really good for arrays, which we're going to learn about later on in this module. And we'll see how we use a for loop with an array. But just keep in mind, if you know how many times something is supposed to run and you know the length of the list of data that you're working with, for loops are awesome.